Welcome back to HQ, presented by Geico. Get more with Geico. The NBA draft just under 2 months away. With no clear consensus number one pick, we could see lots of movement in the field here. But here's how the big board stands as of today. We still have order to be decided. They're going to do that, draft lotteries next week. But for now, we're going to focus on the risers and fallers on the big board. And for more on that, let's bring in basketball analyst Kyle Boone. Kyle, let's start at the top with no consensus number one. It's Alex Sarr's spot to lose at this point. What sends him to the summit in the latest edition of the big board?
Yeah, as you mentioned, JSL, it's a wide open race at number one. Sarr is the number one for us right now on the CBS Sports big board. He's 7 foot tall. He's performed extremely well as an 18-year-old in the NBL this season. Defensively, he's very versatile. He can move very well, I think, from perimeter into the paint. There's a lot of excitement about his movement skills, his athleticism at 7 foot tall. And, you know, he's a 7 foot big with perimeter skills. And I hate to invoke the name Victor Wembanyama, but we saw last season with 7'4" Victor Wembanyama what it looks like when a 7-footer has some perimeter skills. And he has some shades of Wemby to his game. There's a lot of upside here, a lot of untapped potential. He can play like a guard, and at 7 foot tall, I think he's probably the biggest swing in this draft, and he is why number one right now in the CBS Sports top 50 big board.
Point guard Stephon Castle just won a national championship with UConn, averaging 11 points per game, just under 5 rebounds per game. Where is his stock at this point?
Yeah, straight up at this point. He was fantastic for UConn this season as a true freshman. One of the most important pieces for UConn's title-winning team. He drew some comparisons throughout the season as just being kind of like a selfless player for this Huskies team. He wasn't always the guy who was scoring baskets. He wasn't the guy who always had the ball in his hands, but very selfless. He's the guy who always drew the toughest defensive assignments, a lockdown defender, 6'6", has some playmaking ability. I think there's some potential he can develop a little bit as a shooter as well. And I think if you're talking long-term about what he can be in the NBA, there's a lot of excitement for someone who has wing size, who plays like a guard, who can be a really good defensive prospect. So Castle's top 5 right now on our big board, and I think is going to stand here as we look ahead to the NBA draft.
Frenchman Zaccharie Risacher has been the number one pick on some boards that I've come across, and he could end up alongside a fellow Frenchman in San Antonio. You have him at number 5, but this is a guy where there's a high ceiling here for Risacher.
No, absolutely. Yeah, this is a guy who has previously actually been number 1 on the CBS Sports big board, slips down here to number 5 in our latest update. He's a big wing with shooting ability, can space the floor, can shoot it at a high level. Defensively, he's got really good movement skills. He struggled a little bit over the last month, kind of down the stretch here, playing in the pro way, and I think that's of concern a little bit, especially if the kind of selling point for Risacher is him being a big shooter. A wide range of outcomes for Risacher. Could go number 1, could go outside of the top 5. I think it's going to be really interesting kind of seeing how NBA teams evaluate Risacher coming into the NBA draft, pre-draft process, but a guy with a tremendous upside who I think is going to be really interesting for NBA teams in the lottery.
Debate about his talents, debates about how to pronounce his name will continue as we head towards the draft. All right. Dylan Jones is a guy who just completed one of the best seasons in Big Sky Conference history, and he's also a guy that's moving up some boards here. Kyle, what do you like about him?
Yeah, you know, in a draft where there's not a real consensus at the top, I think there's some confidence that Dylan Jones can be a capable NBA player. And for a draft that doesn't have a lot of confidence with capable NBA players, Dylan Jones gets a bump here. He was really fantastic these past 2 seasons for Weber State. He was very good after returning last year from testing the NBA draft, improved as a shooter, improved as a passer. does a lot of things at a really high level, kind of a funky game. He's got a big frame and does a lot of things well. He was a really good kind of playmaker and facilitator for Weber State. Curious to see what he'll look like in the NBA, but I think his shooting has improved tremendously. Defensively, he can fit into a number of different positions. Dylan Jones moving into the top 25 in our big board, and I think a guy who could end up being a strong riser as we go ahead to the NBA Combine as well.
I've never heard a guy's game described as funky before, Kyle. So that's new. You can tell Kyle's a writer, right? He's bringing out all the descriptive terms. Colorado power forward Tristan da Silva described as a well-rounded role player, and there seems to be some value there because here's another guy, Kyle, that's moving up.
Yeah, absolutely. And a guy who got a big bump from a strong showing in the NCAA tournament. We're talking about guys in this draft who you feel confident about projecting into the NBA. Da Silva is a guy who I think you feel confident projecting into the NBA. Very big frame. He's a very good shooter. Someone who I think could be kind of a plug-and-play prospect at the wing position. Can play multiple positions. Good spot-up shooter. Pretty good playmaker. Really underrated. And again, showed out very strongly on the NCAA tournament platform. A guy who I think is rising up boards, and at this point I think is going to be a lock to be a first-round pick in June.
Still have a couple months until the draft. Lastly, let's talk about Baylor center Yves Missi. Was in the top 20, but is now outside of it. So, Kyle, at this point in time, why is his stock dropping a bit here?
Yeah, I think with Yves Missi, it's all about the upside. It's very tantalizing, right? If you've seen Yves Missi play, he makes some plays during games where you just jump out of your chair. You say, whoa, that's incredible. He has amazing athleticism, big frame, a guy who I think is a really good shot blocker, and I think will translate to the NBA. I think the question is how much of a project is he at this point? He's 7 foot tall. He doesn't shoot threes. Not a guy who's really going to space the floor for you. And at Baylor, he wasn't really a consistent producer. So I think he has to go to a right system, to a team that I think is willing to invest in his development. Certainly, again, a lot of excitement, a lot of upside with Yves Missi, but a guy who I think if you're looking at this draft class and projecting ahead, a guy who I think has a little bit more project and development in his future moving forward.
Kyle Boone discussing the NBA big board as we head towards the NBA draft coming up at the end of June. Thanks very much, Kyle. You can see the big board over on CBSSports.com along with mock drafts and everything else you need to know to get you ready for the draft. As we take a look at upcoming NBA league dates, the draft lottery coming up on May the 12th, this next week, and then we get the draft combine, 12th to the 19th. It's all happening very quickly as the NBA playoffs continue. Round 1 of the NBA draft, June 26th, with round 2 on the 27th.